of the organizational motions. I would at this time like to recognize the co-chair for the purpose of a motion.
I move that organizational motions be adopted.
Are there any questions regarding the motion? All those in favor of the motion shall vote yea.
Yay.
Yay. Those opposed shall vote nay. Appears that the yeas have it. The motion does carry. I declare the motion adopted. The fourth and fifth items on the agenda are approval of the minutes of the final report. Everyone should have this document in front of them. The Forest Management Review Commission last met in December of 2022. Normally, in our final meeting of the interim period, we vote to approve our annual report and submit it to the Joint Committee on Government and Finance pursuant to West Virginia Code 5247. However, we did not have that at our last meeting because we did not have a quorum. Similarly, we did not approve the outstanding minutes from our June 2022 and September 2022 meetings because of the lack of a quorum. Since we do have a quorum at this meeting, we're going to vote to approve those minutes as well as the December 2022 minutes, and then we're going to vote to approve the final annual report. So at this time, I'd like to recognize the co-chair to move approval of the minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of the minutes from the June, September, and December 2022 meetings.
The question is on the motion that the minutes be approved. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I declare the motion adopted. The next item on the agenda is the 2022 final report for the Forest Management Review Commission. Liz, who is our committee counsel, we would ask that you explain it. At this time, would you come forward to explain the final report, please?
Hello, everyone. This is the final report is in your packet. It is similar in format to previous year's final reports. It talks about the establishment of the Forest Management Review Commission. It discusses in brief the meetings that we held in the 2022 to 2023 interim season. And it's pretty self-explanatory, talks about who the speakers were and essentially what was discussed. Happy to answer any questions if there are any.
At this time, I know it's a lot of information, more than would be usual, but not having a quorum in the past and being able to approve the final report, there's all this information in front of you. So at this time, are there any questions? Is there any discussion? Are there any amendments? Hearing no amendments, I would like to recognize the co-chair for motion.
I move that we agree to the language of the 2022 final report.
The question is on agreeing to the language of the 2022 final report. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes do have it. I declare the motion adopted. I'd like to again recognize the co-chair to make another motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move, oh no, wait, I'm stuck on a page. I move that 2022 final report be reported to the Joint Committee of Government and Finance.
The question is on a motion that the 2022 final report be reported to the Joint Committee on Government and Finance. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes do have it. I declare the motion adopted. So that was all of our formality that we needed to get through from past meetings, so thank you for your indulgence on that. So at this time, the next item on our agenda, we have some presentations for you regarding a post-audit division legislative audit report, managed timberland program, which is a report dated January 8th, 2023. So at this time, we would like to recognize and ask Mike Jones to come forward. And you just swear in. Raise your right hand. You agree that all the information you're going to present to us will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, sir. Now, if you will please state your name and your position for those who are listening, and go ahead with your presentation, please.
I'm Mike Jones, Audit Manager of the Post Audit Division. I'm going to give you an overview of the Managed Timberland Program audit that was released to the Post Audit Subcommittee in January. In 1990, the legislature passed the Managed Timberland Program Act that allows for West Virginia landowners to agree to sustainably manage timber in exchange for a reduced property tax rate. The program involves two state entities, the Division of Forestry that certifies property as managed timber, and the state tax department that applies the appropriate property tax rate based on forestry's certification. A landowner applies annually to the Division of Forestry for certification of a parcel of property as managed timberland. And once certified, the tax department determines the appropriate tax valuation class for the property to provide to the county assessors. In 1998, a legislative rule was adopted to further guide the program, which is still in effect today. Our review of the Managed Timberland Program revealed several weaknesses in the operation of the program and areas which could be improved to produce better outcomes. The first area to discuss concerns the legislative rule. Statute gives the tax department sole rulemaking authority for the program, even though, as previously mentioned, the program encompasses two distinct functions: certifications of properties by forestry and valuation of properties by tax. According to a legal opinion from Legislative Services, the tax department cannot promulgate rules that encompass the classification of timberland, only the valuation. Any rule enacted by the tax department regarding the certification of managed timberland will cause a conflict in authority. Since the rule-making authority rests solely with the tax department, this also prevents forestry from modifying or promulgating rules encompassing the certification of managed timberland. As a result of forestry's inability to modify the rules for the certification of properties as managed timber, the process has become outdated and inefficient. Currently, the rule requires the use of antiquated mapping and grading systems that existed in 1998. However, current technology far exceeds what was available when the rule was established. Allowing forestry rulemaking authority to make updates as needed would allow the adoption of more efficient and accurate technology. Additionally, the rule does not require a written management plan from the property owner for land being classified as managed timberland. The lack of a written plan hinders forestry's ability to ensure compliance with the program. Currently, the only requirement is for the landowner to develop and implement a plan within 2 years of certification. However, without specific requirements for the contents of the plan or a requirement it is documented and submitted, it is unclear how forestry can ensure that timberland is being managed according to the plan. Another weakness involves the repayment of taxes avoided resulting from improper classification. If managed timberland is found to be improperly classified, statute limits the ability to seek repayment of taxes avoided during the time of the reduced tax valuation. Currently, the repayment of taxes avoided is confined to the first 24 months of certification. In order to enforce this, it would require forestry to physically inspect properties on a regular basis. Given the often remote and inaccessible location of some of these properties, the size of the properties, and the limited staffing resources available at the Division of Forestry to conduct such physical inspections, our audit revealed this to not be a cost-effective use of state funds. Expanding the time frame in which avoided taxes could be recovered due to non-compliance with the management plan or improper classification will allow for more recovery of avoided taxes without causing undue burden on forestry to conduct frequent physical inspections. The current process requires landowners to have their property certified as managed timberland annually. Our audit found this requirement to be inefficient and does not align with other comparable programs throughout the country. Process of annually recertifying property equates to little more than a year-to-year paper shuffle. Forestry supplies a form to each landowner, which was in the program the previous year, containing the same information provided by the landowner the previous year. The landowner then reviews the form and sends it back to forestry with any changes if necessary. The process continues. This results in a significant amount of time to process this paperwork, which could be used for other tasks. It should be noted that this process will be moved online by October 2023 due to the passage of House Bill 2309 from the recent legislative session. We reviewed the managed timberland programs from other states that utilize an ad valorem property tax to identify the recertification policies that may be more efficient and effective. We identified 7 states that can be utilized for comparison. As you can see on the screen, these recertification requirements in other states range from 5 years to indefinite, so long as the ownership does not change. Adopting a similar approach and moving away from the annual requirement would allow forestry to utilize resources in more efficient ways. Many of these states contemplate qualifying events that require recertification, such as change in ownership interest, change in the managed timberland plan, or entering into a conflicting agreement. One recent development where such a conflicting agreement may occur regards carbon capture or carbon sequester agreements. Essentially, such agreements are between West Virginia landowners and third parties who offer to lease land to offset the carbon-producing operations of a company. In many instances, the agreements require activities that conflict with the managed timberland program, making the landowner ineligible for the program in West Virginia. These agreements can last up to 99 years. Neither West Virginia Code nor the legislative rule explicitly contemplates carbon capture agreements and how they could impact the program. Currently, there are over 600,000 acres of forest in West Virginia confirmed to be under a carbon capture agreement and approximately 2.6 million acres in the timberland program. One of the biggest hurdles to determining which properties are involved in carbon capture is the lack of a centralized record of the agreements in effect. Without a record of these carbon capture agreements, there is no way to ensure landowners are not improperly receiving a managed timberland classification while under a separate conflicting carbon capture agreement. As a result, the state cannot be assured that all property taxes are accurately assessed and paid if there are landowners improperly receiving a reduced tax rate. In order to correct this, the legislative auditor suggests the legislature codify a requirement that such carbon capture agreements be noted on the landowner's deed within the county as a conservation easement on the property that exists potentially beyond the life of the current landowner and can preclude certain uses of the land, including the access to minerals or natural resources within that land. In conclusion, the issues noted today concerning the managed timberland program are not detrimental to the operation of the managed timberland program and the many benefits it provides both private citizens and industry throughout the state. However, they do represent areas where modernization can increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the program. These improvements would allow the Division of Forestry and State Tax Departments to better ensure that the program requirements are being met by the landowners and ensure that all property taxes are properly assessed and collected. In order to address these issues, the legislative auditor made the following recommendations. We recommend the legislature provide rulemaking authority to the Division of Forestry for its role in the managed timberland program and consider amending West Virginia Code to remove the language restricting the repayment of taxes avoided to those in the first 24 months of acceptance. Further, the legislature should consider if the annual recertification process is the best interest of all stakeholders and make modifications to the process as necessary. Additionally, if the legislature wished to address the issue of carbon capture agreements, the legislature could amend West Virginia Code 20-12-3 to modify the definition of holder and to clarify the classification of carbon capture agreements as conservation easements, as well as require county assessors to report the easements to the tax department annually. The audit also noted other issues that did not rise to the same level of significance of the issues presented today. These issues include forestry lacks documented policies and procedures and does not perform regular inspections, and forestry and tax have conflicting data regarding the total number of parcels and acres in the program. Each of these issues are discussed in more detail in the report. To correct these issues, the legislative auditor recommended forestry develop internal policies and procedures for their role in the managed timber program, including the appeals process for applicants who are performing regular inspections. Additionally, we recommend forestry and tax modify communications to participants in the program indicating property involved in carbon capture agreements may prohibit managed timberland classification or require landowners to provide notice of any existing agreements. Tax and forestry should also work together to reconcile their data for certified properties and ensure that this data reconciles on an annual basis. Be happy to answer any questions that I can.
We thank you for that thorough presentation, Mr. Jones. Do we have any questions for the presenter in regards to the reports before you? I recognize you. Just state your name clearly for those who are listening, please, and go ahead with your question.
Delegate Jim Butler. Thank you for the presentation. It's hard for me to listen as quickly as you speak sometimes. Sorry. Could you review the tax that the forestry department would, you want to talk about the forestry department can't classify taxation? Is that the way it works?
Right. They each have two separate roles. The certification is done by forestry. The actual application of the tax classes is done by the tax department. But the issue is that they are both encompassed in the same legislative rule. They're not separate issues.
So, I mean, so is that, what does the rule say? Does it say that the tax department does it, or does the rule say that the forestry does it?
The rule lays out what forestry is responsible to do, and it lays out what tax is responsible to do. But forestry doesn't have the ability to make their own rules and modify that as they see fit.
Okay. All right, and then jumping forward in your presentation, this is something I heard a little bit about during the legislative session we just finished, that the carbon capture agreements conflict with the managed timber. Can you explain what the conflict there is?
I am not a carbon capture expert, but the gist of it is some of the managed timberland contracts or the carbon sequester contracts can have activities in it that prohibit the activities that are required of a managed timberland program. So if you have one program saying they have to do X, the other program says they can't do X, that puts those two contracts in conflict.
Okay. So the contract for the greenhouse capture, that would change depending upon whoever it is buying that or purchasing that. Wouldn't that not be the
I
case?
believe, I'm not 100% certain, but I believe that the carbon capture agreement follows through on the property.
Okay, but that's not a set thing statewide though, right? That agreement would be written by whoever purchasing the.
Correct.
Okay. So they may conflict, they don't necessarily conflict.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there's any additional questions on carbon capture, we do have someone here for an expert in that field that may be willing to yield to some questions that didn't provide the clarification you needed or other members need.
Yeah, when we get there, that would be great. Thank you.
Senator Bill Hamilton, your presentation where you listed the 7 states.
Yes.
South Carolina says indefinite as long as ownership does not change. You mean they don't have to, the landowners in South Carolina do not have to report on an annual basis?
Correct.
To the state?
Once they have applied to the program and been accepted, it stays in effect until there is a change in ownership in South Carolina.
You accept a change like that?
That is well beyond my scope of abilities to determine.
Thank you.
Any additional questions for the senator? I just had a couple, if there's no other. So I wanted to hear what you believe your impact to be to the legislation, the House bill that will require some automation. What impact do you see that having going from the printed form to the electronic form?
I haven't studied the legislation as fast, but anything that automates and increases the ability of the public to rapidly do the tasks that they're required of would be a positive thing.
And how were you able to determine that there are 600,000 acres in a carbon capture agreements currently? Or were you able to obtain that number?
That was obtained from our assistant agency, wrap up. They did a lot of work on carbon capture.
Anything further Okay, well, thank the presenter. Next up, okay. So this time we did have someone here that could maybe more adequately answer a carbon capture question. So if you would step up here and identify yourself for those listening appreciate it.
I'm Dr. Peter Shirley. I'm the director of the Joint Committee's Division of Regulatory and Fiscal Affairs.
So I'll just begin there in regards to the minimum of 600,000 acres in carbon capture agreements. What do you feel about the accuracy of that number? And of course, they've stated clearly that that simply is a minimum.
Yes, so that's a minimum. So the primary issue that we had, and our division has studied this several times. I think we presented once in energy, and we presented once last year as well. The biggest issue that we've had is finding information. So because these are private agreements between a landowner and oftentimes a company that's looking to offset its emissions, this document doesn't have to be recorded anywhere. It doesn't have to be published. It doesn't have to be registered. Similar to how post audit's recommendation of conservation easements work, those are required to be filed with the county assessor in the county where that parcel is located. And so because we couldn't go and locate these records, we had to use other sources. And so there are a couple of different carbon capture programs and cap and trade programs in the US. One is sort of all of the northeastern states, so Pennsylvania and Virginia to the north and east of us, up the entire East Coast. It's called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. They have a cap and trade program for their power plant emissions. California has its own cap and trade program. And then the state of Washington, just at the beginning of 2023, started its own cap and trade program as well. And so for all of those programs, the only one that we were able to obtain data for was the California program. And so California has 3 public registries that you can go and register your offsets with. And so when we went and looked for active forest carbon offset projects that were located in West Virginia, we identified about 616,000 acres that we could find there. And so that's what I mean by a minimum, is that we were able to find this public registry for one state, but there are these other programs that we know exist that we weren't able to obtain any information about how many acres there are, where they're located, and then as part of that, we weren't able to obtain any of the the lengths of the terms, the financial compensation, the ability of these landowners to harvest their timber, how much, when, things like that. There's just it was very much a dearth of information.
Sheldon, would you like to be recognized again for any follow-up to your final question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thanks for coming today. I have a little bit of history cutting timber as a small business person, so and I've worked for some people doing timber management. I'll ask this question first. The timber management that I've worked on anyway, we're improving the property, making access roads. Sometimes you do cut some of the species of trees that are not desirable for wood products and so forth. But most of the management that I've seen would actually help with carbon sequestration. I guess my question is there a standard that you're aware of where when a company buys, property or buys the rights for carbon sequestration, is there a standard that everyone goes by, or is this just kind of a wide open process?
I'm not really sure. And again, part of the reason for that is that we don't have these individual agreements. So we can't sort of look at 50 or 100 agreements and say, is there a typical standard by which these agreements are set up? And sort of to your point about the managed timberland program, that was part of I think the initial concern that arose was because the managed timberland is supposed to be managed timberland. Sort of the idea there is that you're harvesting the timber, you're harvesting the wood products. And the concern was, to what extent does that conflict with these carbon offset agreements, which may restrict the amount of timber that you can do, how much, and that sort of thing. And the best answer is that without more information about the specific agreements, it's impossible to know to what extent these, they conflict, to what extent, whatever overlap there might be, should they be allowed, we can't say.
Are there states that you're aware of who actually do require that an agreement like this would be recorded in some way?
None that I'm aware of.
Okay. Are you aware of any conversations between any kind of bodies that would, at any state, like West Virginia or any other state, where we've considered the pros and cons of requiring that this type of information be reported?
There was a bill that I believe passed the House last year that would have required those operating under forest carbon offset programs to register with the state. One other thing that I know that has, I believe, come out since Post Audit did their report, or maybe it was before, I can't recall. I believe the Division of Forestry now, for those who are in the managed timber program, ask on that annual recertification that they do. They now have added a section that asks, is any of this parcel part of a forest carbon offset agreement? And if so, how many acres are affected by such an agreement? So there is some amount of data that the state will now begin to collect on this. The issue with going that specific route is that it will only capture acreages for those who are both in a forest carbon offset program and part of the managed timberland program. So if you're doing a forest carbon offset, but you're not in managed timberland, that information won't be reported under the status quo.
Would it be within the authority of the legislature to pass legislation to say that any type of agreement like this, and I'm not saying I'm even for this, I've not considered pros and cons, but would it be within our ability to do that, to require that any type of contract like that would be reported?
I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't be able to provide that advice, but I know the legislature has discussed that very idea.
So we're going to be running out of time here. It's readily apparent to the chair that we're going to have further discussion at an additional meeting. I know that the co-chair does have questions. Please don't think I'm cutting you short, but we have other presenters, and we've only got a time slot to get through. So everyone's questions are important. I would remind everyone that any questions you do have can be submitted to the clerk in writing, and we can get out a written response to all members. But the co-chair had asked to have an opportunity to address this subject matter, so try to wrap that up in a couple of minutes to get to the next presenter.
Real fast, you don't have to give us an answer, but maybe get it back to us at a later date. Back during January, during the energy meeting, there was a presentation that said 14 counties had carbon capture. Well, every one of those 14 counties are like coal counties. And it's California and Washington State that these companies had got their agreements in those 14 counties. And I've asked the question, why doesn't the state sell carbon capture through the park system? And someone said, well, you can't do it. Well, Michigan State's doing it. So, I just see this as a tool to shut down our natural resource businesses that brings a lot of opportunity to the state, a lot of revenue and so forth. So I know we're running short. We've got 2 more presentations, but if you could get an answer back to some of that, and you can continue to dig to find how many acreages. You said one state's got 614,000. God only knows what else is out there. Good. Thank you.
And if we do have time at the end of the meeting, we have a few minutes, we'll ask him to come back up to stay for the remainder of the meeting, and we can maybe get your questions answered. If not, certainly we'll ask him to return for a future meeting, maybe some more detailed questions that you submit to the clerk so we can get, this is obviously an important subject matter. So thank you at this time. I always hate to shut down questions, but we do have to recognize the time that we have a room slot for. So the next person at this point, we can call Jeremy McGill up.
I need to lose my presentation.
I'm sorry. The gentleman's coming up here to answer that question. While he's doing that, would you just raise your right hand, please? And would you swear that the testimony information you're going to give is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Would you please state your name and your position?
Jeremy McGill, Assistant State Forester in charge of logging, sediment control, and managed timberland with the West Virginia Division. Yes.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna, since we're running a little bit behind, I'm gonna kind of skim through the first part of this. You've already heard some of it. But the legislative audit made a series of recommendations. You all should have a copy of my slide, and I'm just gonna touch on the ones that we felt we really had something to say on. So, develop internal policies and procedures. We intended to comply after the Penn Virginia decision kind of changed things, but managed timberland has been in kind of a flux state, I would say, where we expect legislation about every session. So I really haven't put anything down in writing. We have policies and procedures, but I've been kind of waiting on things to firm up, see if any legislation was going to pass to avoid duplication of effort. We have no position on 4. We support any move away from recommendation 5, where it's annual recertification. The difference in parcels between tax and us, I believe we have found the majority of that in the way that our previous clerk was recording percent interest ownerships in managed timberland. So she was reporting that acreage twice or 3 times or 4 times when that tax was only reporting it once. So I believe we have identified the majority of that discrepancy. We have no position on recommendation 7, which is carbon capture agreements. Whatever the state decides policy is, we'll be glad to cooperate. Legislative audit recommendation 8, we did modify our applications to include a question about forced carbon enrollment, but we really have no way to know whether they're lying to us or not at this point. Okay, issue 1 identified under recommendation 3. There were some issues that were identified, one of which was an outdated mapping system. We have worked with tax, and the weak link in this mapping system that we are looking at is actually the parcel data coming from the counties. Some counties have great parcel data. Some of them have just digitized old tax maps. And some of you might know that the farther you get from the courthouse, the worse those get in certain counties. So what we've actually looked at doing is using the FIA forced productivity grade mapping and assigning an average grade for each county tax district in the state. But if landowners wanted to provide or accurate parcel data was provided at some point, we could then grade those parcels individually. This is the old mapping system you're using. You can see county lines in it clearly. You can see there's a lot of areas where there is actually no data at all, wherever it's white. So it's not really good. It's not good data. So we're definitely want to update that. Issue 2 identified under recommendation 3, valuation calculation overly complex leading to volatility of tax rate. And we were asked to work with tax on this, but tax primarily has to do this. This is a valuation method. And we have been included in the meetings. They haven't left us out. And some possible solutions have been identified with the new calculation method, or perhaps a code change to 11.1C, 11B, subsection A to move away from a future growth value model. But I'll leave that up to tax to discuss further if they want. All right, this is a big one this year, kind of reared its head. It's called the subdivision clause under 11.1C2, subsection 1. Any tract or parcel real estate, regardless of its size, which is part of any subdivision that is approved or exempted from approval pursuant to the provisions of planning ordinance adopted under provisions of section code site black, that code site's broke. It no longer exists. It was moved and repealed. So it's still under it's under chapter 8A, I think now, but it's still code was just moved. It still exists. It's just no longer where that code says it is. We believe at the DOF that that red language at the bare minimum probably needs to go. And the reason why I listed some examples from Hampshire County Municipal Ordinance regarding subdivisions, which is authorized by the section of code outlined there in black that's moved. Subdivisions are individual lots of which plats or deeds were recorded that the clerk, prior to the effective date of the ordinance, which was 2009, is an exemption. Surveying of existing parcels does not alter boundary or prompt a subdivision in any manner is exempted. Well, if you refer back to that language in red, it says that any part of any subdivision that is approved or exempted from approval pursuant to that code that authorizes that county to make their own municipal ordinance regarding subdivisions doesn't qualify for managed timberland. So does the clause really even need to exist? What is the intent of that clause? Perhaps the next clause, an already existing rule, is sufficient to eliminate why the subdivisions were put in the first place. That's not my decision to make. Obviously, that's a policy decision above mine, but it is a problem for our agency and certification. So any tract or parcel of real estate, regardless of its size, which is subject to a deed restriction, deed covenant, or zoning regulation, is already not permitted in managed timberland. So does that cover the intent or not? Or does it need change? That's all I had.
And we thank you for that very informative presentation. And at this time, we'd before we proceed with any questions, the chair is reminded that there was a great tragedy that happened with the West Virginia Division of Forestry. And I'd like for all members to rise for a moment of silence and recognition of the member who made the ultimate sacrifice for his state. We can all just observe a moment of silence, please. Thank you. We return to order. So at this time, are there any questions for Mr. McGill in regards to the presentation that's before you? I know that I have one specifically. No one else has any questions. It pertains to issue 3 that was identified under the recommendation of 3, which I believe is one of your last slides. And I want to know if you're aware of any counties within our state where this subdivision clause has, in fact, not just be a hypothesis of a problem, but has actually created a problem.
So yes, Hampshire County this year gave us a list of 108 parcels that they have previously not been reporting to us as subdivision that they decided this year need to be disqualified. And so and that was right in the middle of the legislative session. It was a disaster. And fortunately, the Hampshire County Commission was willing to work with us and go ahead and grant those landowners. They're not in the program, but they basically absolved their taxes down to what managed timberland rates would be, because we were past the appeals deadline to which those landowners could appeal, and thus would have been deprived due process, and we'd have been in a court case. So this year, we're going to grant those landowners that do appeal, proper appeal through us, then the circuit court if they choose to, and follow their ultimate procedure.
So for clarification of the members, because I think of a subdivision, I think of an acre or 2 acre lot, maybe even a 5 acre lot. Are we talking about tracts of land of that size and scope, or potentially larger pieces of land?
There's tracts over 100 acres.
So this could potentially be affecting tracts of 100+ acres in Hampshire County. If it's affecting in Hampshire County, one would think it could potentially be affecting large landowners all throughout our state.
Well,
if there's certain rules and regulations in place.
I've heard that Grant County and Hardee County both plan to submit additional parcels this year coming. So we'll see when I get there. But
Additional questions for our presenter?
Thank you,
State your
Mr.
name,
Chairman.
please.
Delegate Adam Burkhammer. So last page, just this bottom section on it has been your last slide. Are you proposing that would clarify?
No, that already exists in code.
That's already
It
exists.
exists it's the next section immediately after the section on the previous page. And obviously it is not my goal to determine what the intent of the law is, but if the intent is that, housing subdivisions not be included, maybe that's sufficient.
Okay, well, I'm going to take it a step further then, and we've been having this argument, and I hate to go back to carbon capture, but we're having this argument about when that pertains to the property and can they get the managed timberland. Would that not also go along with the carbon, because it says which limits the use of that real estate in a way that precludes the commercial production and harvesting of timber upon it?
Well, keep in mind that I have not had to remove anybody yet for carbon, but that section of code is the section of code that I sent to the legislative audit when we had, and I've sent to other organizations when they ask, well, why do you have the authority to put the carbon capture credit on the application? That's the section of code I pointed to, and I said, because there is a potential problem, and the rule requires a regular schedule of commercial timber harvest. So if the carbon plan would interfere with that regular schedule of commercial harvest according to their plan, then we believe that under that section of code, we'd at least have an argument as to why we removed the problem.
I'm going to leave it at that for the sake of time, but appreciate you being.
Okay, we're out of time for this presenter. We thank you, Mr. McGill, for being here and your presentation and information provided.
Thank you.
This time, we'd like to call up our final presenter, Mr. Eric Carlson, if you would come forward, please. And while he's setting up, would you raise your right hand? Do you agree that the information you're going to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so you want it? Would you state your name and position for the record for those listening, please?
My name is Eric Carlson. I'm the Executive Director of the West Virginia Forestry Association.
Thank you, sir. As soon as he has you up, you are ready to go.
And I'm not going to go through this whole presentation. You have a copy of that in front of you. The reason I put this up here is a lot of the background. We presented before this commission many times in the last 2 years on this issue. I'm going to speak through a lot of that. For those that are pretty new to this, you can look at the kind of recommendations we've been making for the last 2 years about fixing this program. And stick with the audit recommendations just as Mr. McGill did. First of all, the first recommendation we have rulemaking authority. This is something that really should be, we think that should happen and should be related to forest-related criteria where forestry has the expertise. We certainly think that that's something that could help improve ways to fix some of the things that happen. The second recommendation the audit had was, developing these internal policies for the role, and we certainly concur with those recommendations. We think that is something that is in concurrence with what we've been recommending for the last 2 years. When we move on to the third recommendation, we certainly support that issue related to minimizing the weaknesses in the program. We think that's something that's the last one. I don't really have a comment about the relationship of removing language restricting repayment of taxes. I think that's something for all those in the commission, especially legislators, that's something that you need to think and canoodle over as to how you want to recoup those lost, whether that be 2 years or whatever that is. I think that's something that many other states do have those provisions. We're certainly aware of that. We think that's something that's important. The fifth recommendation that we would want to step into really is related to the recommendations for annual certification. Certainly the new online certification process is a step in the right direction. You saw some of the presentations. We would think that a 5-year recertification as a minimum should be adequate to let people in the program that they don't need to come back. There's no change in their ownerships or the qualifications for the program. They're going to annually certify that on the online system. We certainly think that will save time and efforts on most part. Those that aren't familiar with the program right now, people actually have to get these forms notarized in local notary in these rural areas, these small owners, really, it's sort of a burden to do them. Nothing has changed. It's just an added cost. Forestry's got to process all this paperwork. The online system will be a much improved part of that system. On the sixth recommendation, it talks about the program properties. We think that this is absolutely essential. It's something we put out for a long time. You heard Mr. McGill's presentation about some of the things that need to happen. We also recognize that the Division of Forestry in this program really needs to have qualified staff to do this. They're really limiting the staff they currently have. It's been a challenge for them to even do the minimal amount of this program. You saw a lot of recommendations really come out of the audit, shows just the lack of staffing to be able to do the job that they have. And they really do need to have that. As legislators, you have the ability to change that. I think we've been recommending, as you all know, for the last 2 years, we've been recommending supplementals that have been given to the division just to keep them afloat. And this is a program that certainly needs to have support as well. I'll focus the rest of my time to the last two recommendations because I think everybody's been interested in all these things. We're really unclear on the issue of carbon capture. First of all, carbon capture encapsulates a lot of things. The legislature passed the carbon capture to promote carbon capture when it comes related to natural gas and natural gas production. I think what we're really talking about here is forced carbon offsets, which is very different than the total carbon capture. So I think that's one clarification. Not sure how this recommendation would really fit to some of the other things we have in this state. Carbon capture is a broad sense is going to come to agriculture as well. So how is that going to affect programs such as conservation easements, the state farmland preservation program, forest legacy program that operated by the Division of Forestry does easements on programs. Certainly allowed to harvest and manage those programs require them to have a harvest management plan in these forest legacy programs. Certainly not impeding that. So we are concerned about the term using conservation easements. These are contracts with individual owners for the use of their property. So we do agree on the issue of carbon agreements. And this is something that came up in the legislature this year. There is a benefit to having these carbon agreements registered from both the standpoint of the forest owner. Grandpa decides to put an agreement in place. Somebody inherits that property. They don't see this agreement. Somebody comes in and sells the timber harvester comes in and somebody says, oh, you violated the terms of this contract. There's protection for both the timber purchaser in the future. Most of these we're aware of most of these carbon agreements to date have allowed for timber harvesting. It doesn't require timber harvesting, but it does allow for a substantial amount of timber harvesting. I'll answer some of those questions in the next question. But I think that's something we certainly wanted to see that as a protection from litigation. We don't want to see these kind of things tied up in court, arguing over was there an agreement in place or not. Memo in the county courthouse won't solve that problem. Something natural gas and coal do all the time so that people won't get caught up in that mess. The last recommendation talks about indicating from the property carbon capture agreements, and I'll use the term forest offset agreements, that prohibits timber management activities cannot be classified as managed timberland. That would be, in our idea of the no harvest, we certainly would support that recommendation if there's no harvest allowed at all in these. And there has been, up until this year, there was one company that was doing one no harvest agreements. These were annual contracts and long-term contracts. We're not aware of any company now putting what we would call strict no harvest. The 616,000 acres that were in compliance agreements, those are large property owners that under the California compliance program allows for harvesting up the annual growth. And those companies actually have been a fairly good source up until this year of production of forest products. It does not require them to harvest on that, and they have the voluntary. And so what we're seeing in the industry here lately is the concern that as forest carbon offset prices get to the point where it's worth more to let your trees grow a little longer than it is to harvest those trees, and we're going to see less production of wood supply. So we do have some concerns over that particular market, but that's broader than the managed timberland program. That's all forest ownerships across the state. It's not explicitly the managed timberland program, but it is certainly a concern that's been raised by a lot of our sawmills in the state that don't own large vast tracts of land. They depend on forest owners to put their land up for sale and pay them for that. So that's something that we really would have thoughts about in terms of as we move forward. The other part of this is that we are not seeing any more compliance contracts like the California. They put a suspension on out-of-state contracts now, so we're not going to see those in the future. at least temporarily. We don't know how long-term if they're going to come back, but they've been suspended. What we see now is what we call voluntary markets. And these are registered through other registries. There's two major registries. Vera is one major registry, and American Carbon Registry is another. Who verifies, and they have protocols for managing those. And so those are new things. And as we see time going on, even the registries and these kind of programs are tightening in terms of how they define forest carbon offsets. Can you harvest? How much can you harvest? That is something that's constantly changing. I'll just put it that way, and it is a concern for many of our folks in the industry, but it's also, as you can imagine, it's a benefit to the forest owners that are managing these lands. One of the things I would make as a general comment about managed timberland, I think it's really important. We reflect back to 1990 in West Virginia. Since then, we have developed third-party sustainable forest management systems. Our association helps to manage the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, which is an international program. There's also the Forest Stewardship Council that certified over 700, combined both the Forest Stewardship Council and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative have about 1.2 million acres that are in the managed timberland program that are managed under this third-party audit. You can get on and see the forest management reports, success they do in managing their lands sustainably. So the program has encouraged people in this program to manage their land sustainably. It's a positive thing. We think that to retain the managed timberland program is a positive thing. Just to refine some of these things that need to be improved is really the next step. With that, I'll give it up any questions you may have.
So thank you for the presentation. Questions for the presenter? Go ahead and identify yourself, please.
Evan Hansen, delegate from Montague County. I just want to make sure I understood you correctly, that of the over 600,000 known carbon capture acres that are mentioned in the report, the vast majority of those you think do allow some amount of cutting?
All of them allow most of them allow the biological harvest. To give you some perspective, in West Virginia, the latest Forest Service data, we harvest about 23% of the annual growth in West Virginia statewide, which is less than the amount of trees that die here every year. So we're actually harvesting less than annual growth. Those allow for up to annual growth, 100% of that annual growth. None of them are to 9. Those are public reports.
And then you mentioned a very small number of no harvest agreements that were these 1-year contracts. And that's mentioned in your final bullet point that's up on the slide there. So this is following up on the question Delegate Butler asked for. What specifically does a no harvest agreement conflict with in the managed timberland?
The managed timberland program is designed, and I think the forestry can answer this probably more better than I can, requires them to at some point in the future to manage to harvest trees on that land. The intent of the program is to have this supply chain available for forest products industry.
Even if there's lots of landowners who don't harvest every year, right? Whether or not they have a.
Absolutely.
Right, so agreeing to a 1-year no harvest agreement, or even for that matter, a 99-year agreement might limit it somehow. But wouldn't you agree that that doesn't prohibit harvesting sometime in the future? It just would grow the forest stock.
Well, I think the 99-year agreements, it would be hard for me to stand up here as a professional forester, and I am in West Virginia registered forester, to say that not going into your forest once every 100 years is a good idea to sustainably manage your forest.
Right. It does allow sustainable forest management practices throughout. There's not. They allow harvest.
Yes, they do.
And then I just had one other question about the conservation easements, because that was one of the recommendations. To your knowledge, are conservation easements used for permanent types of deed restrictions or for temporary restrictions?
My experience in many states I've worked in, and in West Virginia, would be for more permanent restrictions. I mean, these are contracts with landowners, just like a hunting lease contract, recreational lease contracts, right-of-ways. Right-of-ways are permanent, those are easements. So, those are things that are typically more permanent.
Okay, that's been my experience too. I just want to make sure. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there further questions for the presenter? This time, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Carlson, for the information, your willingness to answer questions. And we are past our allotted time slot. And again, Chair and co-chair apologize. There were additional questions that we weren't able to get to. that members had, and we're here on board commission, and we're fortunate that we have citizen members on here as well. So again, I apologize that we weren't able to get through this as much information as we'd like to. I think that we're going to be able to have a further meeting in regards to some of these concerns. And I would encourage you again, please, to get any questions you have with the clerk. We'll get them written and answered in writing and to all members. And that also helps give us information for future meetings. So that being said, with no further business to come before the committee, the chair recognizes the co-chair for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn.
All those in favor, respond by saying aye. Aye. We're adjourned.